Now, at this time, I'd like to introduce to you a remarkable individual who is an attorney specializing in a complex, highly specialized body of legal knowledge, Marc Del Piero. Mr. Del Piero has served on the Monterey County Board of Supervisors and also for, I believe, 6 years on the California Water Resources Control Board. He has been an adjunct professor at his and my alma mater, Santa Clara University Law School, teaching water law for 9 years. And tonight he is here to talk about groundwater rights and how it relates to the Cal-Am Slant Well Desalination Project. At any rate, Marc is here to tell us that Cal-Am has no water rights in the Salinas Valley groundwater basin, and that should make us wonder why Cal-Am is proposing to take this water.
Actually, I'm going to do that from here. I apologize. Some of you that know me know that I had back surgery a while back, so I apologize for not standing before you, but I'm going to do this presentation from the chair, if that's okay. Again, clearly there's nothing on television, right? I mean, for a guy who doesn't collect stamps and focuses on water rights issues, to have a room like this when it's not a bunch of students who are required to be there is the closest thing to an act of God that I've ever seen. First of all, let me thank the sponsors of this event for inviting me to talk tonight. What I'm going to do tonight is I'm going to try and condense what normally takes me a half a semester to teach a bunch of law students into about an hour. And so I want to make this offer to anybody and everybody, so long as it's within the time frame that the sponsors have. If you have questions about what I'm talking about, I'll be happy to answer any question you've got. That hopefully will give you some indication of my belief in regards to what I'm representing. Someone asked me tonight, as I walked in here tonight, who I work for. I don't work for anybody in the desalination business in Monterey County. I am employed generally around the state, oftentimes as an expert witness on the law of California water rights. I'm testifying against the state of California and former Governor Brown in regards to the double tunnels that are proposing to increase appropriations of water from the Delta down to Southern California. I've been engaged by 2 counties, a bunch of farm groups up in the Delta, as well as a number of environmental groups, and that's an ongoing process. I also represent several other public agencies, but nobody in Monterey County that's developing a desal plant, nor have I ever represented anyone in Monterey County representing developing a desal plant, or talking about developing a desal plant, or even dreaming about developing a desal plant. And I point that out so everyone understands, although I have a clear and distinct bias in regards to my presentation tonight, it ain't because of money, ladies and gentlemen, I can assure you. The law of California groundwater rights is a law that first was created by the California Supreme Court in about 1906, so over 100 years ago. In California, there are really 2 sources of water. Am I speaking close enough to this? There are really 2 sources of water that are subject to what's known as appropriation. And appropriation, folks, is really a legal word used to figure out how much of a limited supply people are entitled to. So if there's a bucket of water and there are 4 people, everybody would be entitled to a quarter of the bucket. And if the bucket keeps recharging because of rainfall and that allocation stuck, everybody would still be entitled to a quarter of the bucket. If the rain came a lot harder than normal and the bucket started to overspill, that bucket and the amount that spills out of the bucket is surplus to the needs of the 4 people who get 1/4 of the bucket apiece. And that surplus water is then available under the state constitution for someone who wants to put that water to beneficial use. Okay? But it's only available to that, they call them junior appropriators. It's only available to junior appropriators as long as it keeps raining. When the heavy rains stop and the water stops spilling, then those senior appropriators, the ones who have the right to a quarter of a bucket per party from the beginning, still get their quarter of a bucket, but the juniors get cut off. That's the law both in terms of surface water rights as well as groundwater rights in the state of California. In Salinas Valley, the water supply that everybody in the city of Marina and everybody in Castroville and everybody in Salinas and all the farmers from Neponset and Mulligan Hill all the way south to Bradley rely upon is a percolated groundwater basin. Now, what does that mean? That means that unlike the Carmel Valley, where there's a river and the flow of the river underneath the ground emulates the surface flow. Unlike that Carmel Valley example, the Salinas Valley is not like that. The Salinas Valley, although it has a river in it, is called a percolated groundwater basin. And what that means is that underneath the river, there's no defined channel, subterranean channel of the river. The water that flows in the river, depending upon the season, percolates into the ground and spreads out all over the place. Well, why is that important? The reason it's important is because when the California Supreme Court articulated the law in regards to appropriative rights related to groundwater back in 1906, they made a point of saying that everybody who has a piece of property that overlies a groundwater basin, so sort of like this cup, if you own a piece of ground, say 10 acres, and in the bottom here is some water that you would drill a well into to get a water supply. Everyone whose property overlies that groundwater basin, that body of water that's buried in the ground, is entitled to what's called their correlative right. It's their fair share. That's really what it means. Correlative right is nothing more than a fair share allocation. Except a fair share allocation is only allowed so long as the amount of water collectively taken out by everybody does not exceed what's known as the safe yield. Remember what we were talking about in terms of the bucket, and the first 4 people get a right to the quarter of a bucket apiece. As long as it rains and the bucket overspills, there's not a problem. But if it stops raining and the bucket starts to draw down as those people who have 4 water rights start taking it, that bucket is overdrafted. It's overdrafted. What it means is that you can't service the needs of the senior water rights holders. Okay? The Salinas Valley is a huge groundwater basin, but the Salinas Valley is an overdraft. Why is it an overdraft? Real simple. We take too much water out of it. Is this a new issue? No, it is not. I was born in 1953. I'm 66 as of 2 weeks ago. In 1946, before I was born, in 1946, the Army Corps of Engineers determined that the Salinas Valley was in a groundwater overdraft. It wasn't bad in 1946, but it was clearly an overdraft. What's the consequence of that? Well, the consequence was that subsequent to that determination by the Army Corps of Engineers, over the course of the next decade, the county and a number of property owners, many of whom were close to the coast, and keep in mind, ladies and gentlemen, this was when Marina was still an unincorporated community that was really nothing more than a train stop. Many of the property owners along the coast decided that there were 2 problems that they had. One was the encroaching seawater intrusion that they were suffering in their shallow wells, and in those days their wells were oftentimes 60 to 90 feet deep. And the other problem that they were having was flooding, because at that time neither the San Antonio River nor the Nacimiento River, which are the 2 biggest tributaries in Monterey County to the Salinas River, were dammed. And so in major flood events, everything in the lower end of the valley got flooded. In the late 1950s, the county and all of the property owners within what was known as Zone 2A got together and they voted to assess themselves to build the dam. The purpose of the dam at Lake San Antonio was expressly to do two things: control flooding and facilitate the recharge of groundwater into the basin to reverse the seawater intrusion that had been manifesting itself since the Army Corps of Engineers identified it in 1946. What happened? Well, everybody collectively got together and started paying the bill, and they built Lake San Antonio and the dam there. And a few years later, they thought, hell, that's a good idea, we're going to do that again. Much to the chagrin of the Board of Supervisors in San Luis Obispo County, they did it in San Luis Obispo County. And so the County of Monterey was able to capture the water rights in back of Lake Nacimiento. And for those of you that have been reading the news, you know that the homeowners around Lake Nacimiento are now suing the County of Monterey because they say that it releases too much water into the Salinas River for percolation into the Salinas Valley. Why are these two things important? These two things are important because it demonstrates historically that the property owners who have overlying groundwater rights in the Salinas Valley have been working consistently and uniformly since the late 1950s to ensure a remedy, or multiple remedies, to the seawater intrusion problem that presents itself near the coast. Okay? That has gone on now for quite a while with a number of other projects. In the 1990s, there was a project that was developed. You all have seen the purple valves between here and Moss Landing. It's the wastewater reclamation project for agriculture that was originally built by the Monterey Regional Water Pollution Control Agency. They now call it Water One. That project was constructed expressly to provide a supplemental water supply for agriculture in the area that was intruded with seawater, paid for by the farmers. Again, a demonstrative example of the fact that the farmers were concerned about their groundwater supply and the preservation of their groundwater supply, and so they created supplemental supplies in order to offset the pumping, conserve the existing groundwater that existed, and continue to produce agricultural commodities on the farmlands that had been designated for that purpose. Equally true in the late part of the last decade, when they built what's known as the rubber dam. Same deal. Creation of an assessment district expressly for the creation of what's known as the rubber dam down near Spreckles. Primary purpose of that was not flood control at all. The primary purpose of that was percolating water into the ground so as to facilitate agriculture and to inhibit continuing encroachment of seawater into the aquifers. Okay, so why is that important, all of this history? It's important because, again, it demonstrates the property owner's intent to preserve and recharge their groundwater supplies. Now, one of the arguments that has been advanced by the California American Water Company is they're going to salvage water. You just heard from our moderator that the slant wells that were originally represented to be taking, quotes, ocean water, they aren't taking ocean water. They're taking water straight out of the Salinas Valley groundwater basin. Now, I just spent the last 10 minutes explaining to you how the water in the Salinas Valley groundwater basin has been recharged over the better part of 6 decades by the property owners. And I forgot to tell you, you all pay the same assessments because you're all in the same assessment district. You're paying the bill to recharge the aquifers, and you have been since 1958 when they did the first assessment for Lake San Antonio.
Marina.
Pardon me? You, Marina. Yeah. If you live in Cardinal Valley, you can forget what I said. You got your own problem. Okay? Well, I point this out so that it drives home the relationship between a party that has never put a dime into the recharge of the Salinas Valley and their intent to exploit the aquifers of the Salinas Valley. and the proof that's been demonstrated by the studies done and conducted by the Marina Coast Water District that now proves that they're going to be exploiting freshwater resources. I point this out so everyone gets it. And if I'm not being real clear right now, if someone doesn't understand what I just explained to you, I mean, in a nutshell, what's going on, please raise your hand and I'll do it again, I promise. Okay?
Hacienda was in 57, San Antonio was in 68.
Forgive me, you are absolutely correct. I
And rubber
apologize.
dams percolate water, they divert water right out of the river into the system.
I'm sorry, say again?
Yeah, just 2 points of note for the audience.
Good. And he's correct. I reversed the dates. I apologize. The long and the short of all of this is that in terms of the history of groundwater rights in the Salinas Valley, we have not had an adjudicated basin. This is not an adjudicated basin. What does that mean? That means where someone files a lawsuit to adjudicate the basin. And I passed out earlier, I don't know, and you'll forgive me, I didn't anticipate, frankly, I didn't think this many people were going to show up. I passed out a couple of documents earlier. The first one has a cover sheet on it that shows from the office of the state legislature. Do you have those over there, Kathy?
Yeah, I do.
Yeah, and the reason I wanted to bring these along was because one of the arguments that's been advanced is that CalAM's got a letter from a junior attorney who works for the State Water Resources Control Board saying that the doctrine of salvage water is what they're going to rely on. No, not that one. That one. You want to, okay, Kathy, just read the cover, read it, just read the cover.
It says, Water Rights, Issues and Perspectives, and it's from the Legislative Analyst's Office, presented to Senate Natural Resources and Water Committee, Honorable Fran Pavley, Chair.
Okay, and would you open it up and read what I highlighted in yellow?
Okay, it says, Court System has primary jurisdiction over most groundwater rights determinations.
Why is that important? Because getting a letter from a junior attorney working for the State Water Resources Control Board is like me getting a letter from my mom. The State Water Resources Control Board was created in 1968 by the Port of Cologne Act. And when the Port of Cologne Act was passed and enacted into law, the state legislature did not grant to the State Water Resources Control Board any authority over groundwater in the state. I was actually on the state board for 8 years, but that's okay. They didn't grant it to them. The state board doesn't have authority over percolated groundwater, particularly percolated groundwater in a non-adjudicated basin. Never have. So, hanging your hat on a letter from a junior lawyer, and I point this out now, I've said this 3 times because I want everybody to understand. The state board, the 5 members never voted on this letter. This is an opinion letter from a junior attorney, from an agency that doesn't have any jurisdiction. Okay? That's what the California American Water Company has now spent millions of dollars from the ratepayers in the Monterey Peninsula on. Maybe. Do they have groundwater rights? I can assure you. If they had groundwater rights, they'd have shut me up years ago. Because this has got to be the most miserable experience they can possibly have, having a guy like me who's not getting paid by anybody sit up here and recite chapter and verse the history of groundwater rights in the state of California. But that's the circumstances that we find ourselves in. The Port of Cologne Act never granted that authority to the State Water Board. Moreover, for the people who are really boring, kind of like me, we look around all over the place for a copy of this book. It's called The California Law of Water Rights. Why is it so interesting? Because it's the most comprehensive book on water rights that you could possibly imagine. Unfortunately, it was written in 1953, the year I was born. But It has a 5-paragraph section on the law of salvage water rights. That's it. 5 paragraphs in a book that was published in 1953. That's the total history of case law in regards to the concept of salvage water rights. Well, why is that important? Well, it's important because you got to read the footnotes in these 5 paragraphs. And in these 5 paragraphs, there are 3 cases that are quoted. One was decided in 1896, one was decided in 1889, and the most recent one was decided in 1908. Okay? 1908 was the most recent case handed down related to the doctrine of salvage water rights. And you know why that's significant? Because the California legislature redid the entire water code in 1914. There has not been a case in regards to salvage water rights heard by any court of appeal or the Supreme Court since then. Okay? So, no water rights, millions of dollars spent on a project where they don't have any overlying property, never paid any money into the assessment district, and they're relying on 3 cases that are old, that were decided before my grandfather was born. Okay?
Actually, we'll allow questions from the audience, 10-minute period after Mark.
And I promise I'll answer every question everybody
I
has.
just want to know what salvage water rights are.
Oh, forgive me. Salvage water rights is the argument that Cal-Am's been advancing. They've been telling everybody, if you read the newspaper article in anticipation of this hearing tonight, that salvage water rights is what Cal-Am is relying on, and it's a reference in the letter from the State Water Resources Control Board junior attorney. Why does a junior attorney from the State Water Resources Control Board reference salvage water rights as a possible way of acquiring water rights in the non-adjudicated Smiths Valley? Because there's no other way to acquire water rights. They had to go back over 100 years to find any kind of case law anywhere, except that case law is now no longer valid because the codes were changed 7 years after the last case was decided. And there's a couple of lawyers in this room who may or may not know much about water rights, but they understand the consequences of the state legislature overturning case decisions that are over 100 years old. So, we'll move on. As part of the percolated groundwater basin that we all rely on in this valley, agriculture has played a major role in developing water recharge facilities. But more recently, the bill has been paid more by urban users. The insidious thing about what's going on here with the slant wells is, as was pointed out at the very beginning, the slant wells are not pulling seawater. They're pulling fresh water out of the aquifer. Why are they not pulling seawater? Because, as was shown in the diagram that was up on the screen, the wells are not being drilled long enough, even a slant well, are not being drilled long enough to get out into the ocean. Why is that? The reason that's the case is because the Monterey Bay National Marine Sanctuary, NOAA, National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, would have objected to wells going out into their primary jurisdiction. So when confronted with that, Cal-Am shortened them up. They shortened them up, and when they shortened them up, they stopped being offshore and started pumping groundwater from the basin. Some people may ask, well, why are they relying on wells anyway? The reason they're relying on wells is not necessarily a scientific decision. It really is largely a political decision. The California Coastal Commission hates desal projects. They hate desal projects. And I point this out because the largest desal project in the western United States is in Carlsbad, It was built by Poseidon Resources Corporation. It's up and fully operational, and they got the developers ended up having to fight four separate lawsuits prior to getting their permits to build the project. Equally true in terms of the project that Poseidon has been pursuing in Huntington Beach. There are no desalination plants in California, other than one small one in Cambria that's under a building moratorium that relies on the technology being advanced by Cal-Am. None, except the one in Cambria. And I would, if you've ever been to Cambria, you know you can't compare Cambria to the water demands of the Monterey Peninsula and the Monterey Peninsula Water Management District. It's ridiculous. Yet, that's the example that the Coastal Commission staff continues to point out. Why is it that every successful desal project in the state of California and everywhere else in the continental United States, and frankly everywhere else in the world, relies on a screened seawater intake? Because that's the technology that works. And contrary to what everyone tells you about how it'll have an adverse effect on the critters in the ocean, and please understand, I served on the committee that helped establish the Monterey Bay National Marine Sanctuary. The technology used for screening seawater intakes is the difference between what it was in the 1980s and what it is now, is the difference between Orville and Wilbur Wright flying on a beach in North Carolina and us sending somebody to the moon. The technology to avoid unintentional impingement of biological organisms into the seawater intakes is massive, and there's no reason in the world at this point, particularly given the minuscule amount of water that would be necessary in order to satisfy the requirements in the Monterey Peninsula, that a seawater intake with an appropriate screen could not be utilized. You need to tell me when to shut up. Okay. I'm going to run through some additional dates for you because, as I said, I apologize. I didn't make enough copies of all of this. There are some things here that you're welcome to, and I think Kathy, if somebody asks, she'll be happy to make copies for you to either take home or receive later. In 1984, why do I bring up the Coastal Commission and their antagonism towards seawater intakes? In 1984, the Board of Supervisors of this county adopted and approved and certified the North and Monterey County Local Coastal Plan. What's that? That's the document governing the land use immediately north of the city of Marina. Okay? It was adopted and approved by the California Coastal Commission as well. In that document, there are multiple policies that prohibit both the export of water and also the utilization of water for any purpose other than agriculture in the area immediately north of the city of Marina. Now, why is that important? Because when the tests were actually done on the so-called slant wells that were supposed to be sucking seawater, that are actually pulling water out of the aquifer, the cones of depression for those wells are so big that they are taking water not simply from the sand plant property. They're pulling water from underneath farmland that belongs to the Ag Land Trust and two other property owners. This is not conjecture. This is from the exhibit that the California American Water Company presented to the California Coastal Commission in direct violation of the policies in their own certified LCP. And they ignored it and went forward with issuing the permit. In 1989, in this county, the Board of Supervisors approved an ordinance that limits who can own a desal plant to public agencies. I actually helped write that ordinance in 1989. We did that for a reason. We understood at the time, and I wish I could tell you I was the smartest guy on the board. I wasn't, but I knew a little bit about water even then. The board collectively knew that in the event a desalination plant was going to be necessary, and we knew it was going to be necessary because There are no more major reservoir sites within Monterey County that are available for development. There are two major reservoir sites that are potentially developable, but you can't develop them because they're in the Los Padres National Forest. There's one on the Arroyo Seco and one down on the Nacimiento, but you can't develop them because federal law prohibits it. We knew at the time in '89 that ultimately a desalination plant was going to be necessary in order to sustain the potable supplies for communities close to the coast, specifically Marina and Castroville. We also knew that in the event that a desal plant was owned by a private entity, it would hold hostage the entire economy of that portion of Monterey County in perpetuity. And so we mandated in that ordinance that the owner of the desal plant had to be a public agency, because public agencies under California law aren't allowed to make a profit. That ordinance is still on the books. Unfortunately, the Board of Supervisors ended up in a big lawsuit with Cal-Am, and they were facing massive penalties because of the misrepresentations that members of the board and their staff made about the availability of water rights that they had. This all took place in the last decade. In the last decade, there was a project that came together where County of Monterey and Cal-Am and a Marina Coast with a different board joined together to pursue a desalination project. Interestingly enough, during the testimony that was presented to the California Public Utilities Commission in regards to that project, Cal-Am's engineers actually admitted on the record they had no groundwater rights. It's in the record of the California Public Utilities Commission. They admitted on the record they had no groundwater rights, and that's why they were doing this so-called joint venture with the county and Marina Coast. That project fell apart for a variety of reasons, and so now we have a situation where Cal-Am is, in spite of the fact they admitted they had no groundwater rights, is attempting to pursue the exploitation of groundwater and groundwater supplies that have been paid for by everybody else. 10 minutes?
Yeah.
I could finish.
And then questions.
Yeah, sure. A couple of things that you need to be aware of. In 1999, there was a guy named Fred Keeley. Anybody remember Fred Keeley? Good. Everybody, a lot of people remember Fred Keeley. Fred Keeley was our assemblyman. And in 1998, actually, when the law went into effect in 99, but in 98, Fred carried a bill, passed the state legislature, signed by Governor Pete Wilson, directing the California Public Utilities Commission to do a comprehensive study to determine the optimal location for a desalination plant to serve the needs of the Monterey Peninsula, because at that time it was clear that Cal-Am was no longer going to be able to take water out of the Carmel River in violation of the law. So Fred carried the bill, good bill, governor signed it, and the CPUC was ordered to go do the study. And they did. They produced the study. 2002 and 2003, they produced the study, and the result of the study said that the optimal location for the construction of a desalination plant to affirmatively address the needs on the Monterey Peninsula, as well as seawater intrusion problems in and around Marina and the Salinas Valley and Moss Landing and even up into the Pajaro Valley, was the location in Moss Landing that used to be called National Fractories. That's the optimal location pursuant to the independent study done by the California Public Utilities Commission, published in 2002-2003. With the seawater intake, that project didn't go forward because it called for a publicly owned facility, and because Cal-Am didn't have control of the seawater intake. Another public agency ended up with a long-term lease for that and a partnership with Poseidon Resources. Remember, those are the folks who actually have built a functional desal plant in Carlsbad and Huntington Beach. Some of the people who have done desal before, who actually know what they're doing. But the option of joining with Monterey Peninsula Water Management District was poo-pooed by a variety of folks, including most vigorously by Cal-Am's representatives, and the project never went forward. Building a desal plant on the Monterey Peninsula or for the Monterey Peninsula is not that, it's not that complicated. If you avoid the political pitfalls that Monterey County has had to suffer from for years and years and years. I'm sure I'm going to offend a bunch of people when I say this. It is unbelievably sad that issues like water rights and property rights of people in the Slings Valley and the regulatory process for the construction of a desalination plant that is clearly needed to protect and preserve the health and safety of the residents of Monterey County are tied up in what truly is nothing more than a political fight and a fight over who's going to make profits off of everything. And I say that with a note of bitterness, because in the time that it's taken, from the time that Cal-Am was told that they could no longer illegally steal water out of the Carmel River by the State Water Resources Control Board in 1995, until now, that's what, 24 years? I mean, you know, my old standard joke is I had hair when that happened. I don't know that I'm going to be able to live another 24 years listening to the lame excuses that are promulgated by a continually new group of Cal-Am executives explaining why they can't do what everybody else in the world seems to be able to do. It's all about profit, ladies and gentlemen. And unfortunately, at this point in time, Cal-Am is attempting to trade the illegal stealing of water out of the Carmel Valley for the new illegal stealing of water out of the non-adjudicated percolated groundwater basin of the Slings Valley.
Mark, I'd like to thank you very much for your time and your expertise.